The head of MI6 2 days ago said that it doesn't matter what would happen in Ukraine, they're going to continue cooperation with Ukrainians. They want to stay there. And just assume if Russia does something like this to the United Kingdom, there is a lot of opportunities, by the way, in that land, and not the land, that combination of lands. But Russia is not interested in that, but they're coming to Russia. They want to be closer to Russia. And do you think that would influence, that would somehow change the mindset of Russians toward the British? So far, they try to say, we're trying to negotiate all of that. But I don't see any situation under which the, Putin administration would accept the British intelligence being in Ukraine in the aftermath of any settlement in Ukraine.
Well, I think you can't completely purge the presence of British intelligence, as you can't purge the presence of the Mossad and the CIA and so forth. They're always going to be there. But what you try to do is you try to contain them in certain ways. You try to know who they are. You try to surveil their activities so that you understand where what they're up to, where the threats are coming from, and so forth. So it's not a question of not accepting British intelligence. I think that's not even realistic. It's a question of not accepting British troops on the ground, or German troops, or French, or whoever would go there. American either, because even if it's true, as Vladimir Putin has said, that he trusts Donald Trump, Donald Trump is not going to be in the White House 3 years from now. And we don't know who's going to be in the White House next. So Russians cannot make an exception to their, they cannot compromise their security concerns because they have a good relationship with Donald Trump and Steve Witkoff, because 3 years from now, they might have to deal with Anthony Blinken or Jake Sullivan or somebody like that. So they cannot make an exception for that. And so they have to insist on their security concerns being completely and totally satisfied and respected, and to arrange a completely new security architecture for not just for that region, but for Europe in general.
Yeah, I'm sure the concept that you're talking about, because in today's Russia, Iran, China, India, you see these agents being there, gathering information. But the core issue for Russia would be the government in Ukraine, how the government would behave, what would be the agenda on the part of government, and who are these nationalists, ultra nationalists, or neo-Nazis in Ukraine? What would be their position? These are huge questions, in my opinion, when it comes to Ukraine.
Yeah, huge questions. The British have evacuated about 8,000 Nazi allied troops and officers from Ukraine after World War II. And they brought them to Britain and to Canada, and they are still there, and they are organized. And I presume that this is what's going to happen after the war finishes in Ukraine, that a large number of these Ukrainian neo-Nazis are going to be evacuated. They're going to be settled probably in Canada. And they're going to keep them there as maybe even a government in exile of some sort. And they're going to try to keep them for the next opportunity to try to take down Russia, because they've been trying to take down Russia for centuries now, depending on how you want to cut it. But there's been, European bankers have been financing invasions and other means of taking over Russian government for several centuries. There was the Swedish invasion and the Polish Lithuanian invasion, and Napoleon in 1812, and Hitler, of course, Operation Barbarossa in 1941, but there were also attempts to penetrate into the Russian governing structures and install a puppet ruler. That goes back to 1500s. Even, you had like two false Dimitris where, they tried to pretend that they find some guy in Poland and they say like, oh, he's the son of Peter the Great, and he's the rightful heir of the Russian throne. And then they bring him to Moscow and they install him there. And then, the Russian people rebel and chase them out. But they've been trying to do this for a very long time. And even the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution was financed and organized by Western financiers. So it was, American, British, German, Swedish bankers were funding the Bolshevik Revolution to have their government in Moscow, and they succeeded. I grew up in the communist world. This is not what they taught us, but after 50 years after an event, a lot of documents are released, and we now know for certain, this is not a conspiracy theory, we know for certain that this is actually what happened from United States congressional investigations and State Department files, that in fact New York bankers, in cooperation with German and Swedish bankers and intelligence agencies, actually orchestrated the Bolshevik Revolution and installed the communist government there, which remained loyal to them until Stalin took over and then conducted a purge. But I think that in some way, probably at the central bank level, they remained, the liaisons remained.
Yeah. Alex, looking at the conflict in Ukraine, and we are approaching 4 years of the conflict. And despite, we know that one of the main reasons that this conflict has lasted, a lot, approaching 4 years, is because of some, operational consideration on the part of the Russian army, changes that has happened, how the Russian army has been transformed. The transformation of the Russian army is so amazing to see what has happened to the defensive, so much an army which was designed for defensive aspects right now is prepared to do any offensive operation outside of Russia, in my opinion. But putting all these, military and operational issues aside and looking at the main goal of the Russian president, which would be a greater, strategic agreement with the United States. That's why they knew that even before Donald Trump coming to power, they were somehow, thinking of, if Donald Trump comes, what would change, what would bring Donald Trump to the table. And we are pretty much, getting to the end of the conflict, in my opinion. And do you think that Putin would get whatever he had in his mind in terms of the security, this sort of comprehensive security with the West agreement, some sort of agreement that would include, all these players in the West? Because after all, I don't see Europe being there. Europe is somehow missing in the picture. And in my opinion, in my humble opinion, I believe that Europe should be part of the agreement. Europe must be part of the agreement, but it doesn't seem that's the case.
I think that Europe is now hostage to the European Union and to these leaders like Macron, Merz, Starmer, who are completely compromised in some way and who are executing foreign policy completely against the interests of their own people. And I think that this is going to remain the case until these people are thrown from power. And then what happens afterwards, I'm pretty sure that once if AfD manages to form the next government of Germany, that the situation will change. And I think that one of the first things that they're going to want to do is to really reconnect the Nord Stream pipelines. And to do that, they're going to have to talk to the Russians, and they're going to come to agreements. They're going to reestablish diplomatic relations. They're going to reestablish trade relations. And then one of the objectives of the 28-point peace plan that Trump cabinet floated is to normalize relations with Russia and to lift all the sanctions. And I think we're inevitably going to that. It's just going to be without the EU, without Ursula von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas, without Merz and Macron and Starmer. And I think that the only real problem is probably the UK, Britain, because there the Russophobic mindset is so deeply entrenched that it's going to be very, very hard for them to turn the page. And because ultimately Britain would have to go back to being like a neutral island nation minding its own business. And I think that their current structure of power have been, they're rooted there for centuries. They're not going to go away. And I think that the British people are very far from making that change. It would have to be some kind of a very thorough revolution, complete change in government, maybe overthrowing the monarchy and instituting something completely different. But once the United Kingdom can no longer maneuver their allies into wars and into confrontation, once they no longer have the unconditional support from the United States, there's not much that they can do from that point on. They're going to have to rethink what they're doing. And I think that this time around, neither the Russians nor the neither the Russians nor the Chinese are going to just say, well, okay, carry on as usual, because they know that these people never give up. They regroup, they maybe adapt their strategy, but they keep attacking because their business model is colonialism. So you have to take political control of Russia, of China, of Iran, in order to be able to extract wealth from them. And that's going to stay a constant, as it has done for a few centuries. And I think that at this juncture, I think that the Russians and the Chinese are going to continue to exert pressure on the UK to reform very thoroughly. And I think that this is going to last a long time, because I expect that they're going to go by legal means, demanding reparations. The Indians, for some reason, calculated that during the British rule, about $44 trillion worth of wealth in today's terms have been extracted from India. I don't know why they made that calculation, but probably not because they were bored. Maybe because they will want to make amends. They're going to demand reparations at some point when they can. Right now it's not realistic, but who knows? A few years down the road, maybe it will be realistic. The Russians have, similar demands, and the Chinese as well. It was the British Empire who subjected China to a century of humiliation, and then used Japan as their proxy, which resulted in 30 million dead Chinese. So I don't think that they're just going to let this problem sit there and fester until maybe another generation for them to try this again.